Jordan Peterson pants on there. I don't even know what to make of that. What's that? Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know quite what that was bad or good, you know. Huh? Yeah. Is this thing on? It is, okay. Well, we have to wait a couple minutes here. Is Gardner here? Yeah, oh, okay. Don't tell him I said this, okay? He saw me beforehand. He said, "Stu, these were the toughest readings that you've." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "But I don't want you telling anybody I said that." So I don't respect Gardner, so I told you. Yeah. Okay, well, I think it's okay to get started here. My wife, who's downstairs, I think, cleaning up, she volunteered to catalog the books downstairs. Was it Bishop White? Yeah, the Bishop White Library, yeah. And so I come over with her. I often come over with her and sit there and just do some work. And she often interrupts me in my work because if she didn't look at these books and just did what she was supposed to do, just catalog them, she starts reading practically every book. And so I told her last time, I said, you know, you're going to be dead before you get anywhere near going cataloging these books. And she says, well, look, listen to this one. She says, this is interesting. And I said, okay. So this was from the Holy Bible containing the Old and New Testament and the Apocrypha, Volume 1, Genesis to Esther, Ballantine Press, 1911. So this thing was published, 3 volumes, because I started looking at it, and it was a 300th anniversary of the King James Bible. And there's an epistle dedicatory to the Most High and Mighty Prince James. So this is written 1611, okay? And she says, listen to what it says. So I said, yeah, I'll actually open up on Wednesday night with this. So this is to King James. The Lord of heaven and earth bless your majesty with many and happy days. that as his heavenly hand has enriched your highness with many singular and extraordinary graces, so you may be the wonder of the world in this latter age for happiness and true felicity, to the honor of that great God and the good of his church, through Jesus Christ, our Lord and only Savior. So I thought, because this is Lewis's view, the church has lost its way in terms of the centrality of the notion of happiness as our thought focuses. We look at life. This is the central notion, and here it is in the dedicatory to the mighty Prince James. That God has blessed him with his happiness, true felicity, to the honor of God. And I thought, yeah, interesting. So that is the dedicatory statement for tonight's little talk. Now, I want to, and my wife, she also tells, hi Gardner, I already broke my word to you. She says, Stu, you better go over a couple things. People, you don't want them unnecessarily upset. So, okay, I said, I will go over a couple things here. First, Lewis was not, get this through our heads, Lewis was not a hedonist, okay? He was not a hedonist. He was a hedonist about happiness. Now you might say, well, what's the difference? And I thought I went over this the first week, but I probably did, but it's hard to get in our minds. Hedonism is the view that there's one and only one intrinsic good. There's one and only one intrinsic good. And there's one and only one intrinsic evil. So the good is pleasure, the evil is pain. That's hedonism. But you could not be a hedonist, yet accept the hedonist view of happiness. And the hedonist view of happiness is, happiness consists of experiences of pleasure. But Lewis was not a hedonist because he believed there was at least one other intrinsic good. And you picked it up, I'm going to take us back, we'll pick it up in one of the readings we had the first week, man or rabbit. Now I'm just going to read this to you because this is Lewis's view. Quote, again, where the materialist would simply ask about a proposed action, will it increase the happiness of the majority? The Christian might have to say, even if it does increase the happiness of the majority, we can't do it. It is unjust. So on Lewis's view now, you could know, or at least believe, probably is a better way of putting it, that if you perform a certain action, you could increase the happiness of so many people. But what you're doing, Lewis said in particular cases, might be unjust. Lewis thought injustice was intrinsically evil. And he thought justice is intrinsically good. And right there, that tells you he's not a hedonist, even though he accepts the hedonist view of what happiness is. Further, he would say, if he were here, if you disagree with me, my understanding of happiness, he would look at you and he'd say, well, what's your conception of happiness? If you disagree, okay, but what do you think happiness is? And he was a Platonist. Now what that means is he believed there were certain concepts we had access to, and he would frequently, Platonists try to illustrate their views with the idea of, if you recognize a line as crooked or not straight, you must know what a straight line is, because you're going to assess the crookedness of a line in light of your concept of a straight line. So Lewis would say, if you think my conception of happiness is wrong, you must have a conception of what happiness is. And he would like to know what you think happiness is. And that's where your kind of philosophical discussion would get off the ground. Lewis, I said, I think last week, something like this, pleasure's intrinsically good. And Lewis believed if it's intrinsically good, God can't make pleasure intrinsically bad any more than God could make himself both exist and not exist at the same time. You say, make himself exist and not exist at the same time. Lewis, yeah, that's so incoherent. God can't do that. God can't make himself exist and not exist at the same time. So I thought I would read you just a little, just so you understand Lewis's view of omnipotence or almightiness. This is from The Problem of Pain. And you get an idea of what Lewis thinks about God's power from a passage like this. I'm just going to read to you. But I know very well that if it is self-contradictory, it is absolutely impossible. The absolutely impossible may also be called the intrinsically impossible, because it carries its impossibility within itself instead of borrowing it from other impossibilities, which in their turn depend upon others. It has no unless clause attached to it. It is impossible under all conditions, in all worlds, and for all agents. All agents here includes God himself. His omnipotence means power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix to them the two other words God can. So on Lewis's view, God can't do just anything if you take anything literally. God can't make himself both exist and not exist at the same time. It's just logically impossible. Similarly, God can't make pleasure bad, and God can't make pain good. God can't make justice evil, and God can't make injustice good. Lewis thought that the moment you cut the notion of kind of reasonableness or rationality out of God's nature, God becomes potentially just an arbitrary dictator, despot. God just ends up being able to do anything. And you could wake up tomorrow morning, read the local paper or go online, and says, people discover God declares justice evil. Lewis would say, no, you would know whoever wrote that up was just talking nonsense. It's just not possible because God is, as he says, bound by what's intrinsically possible and impossible. Lastly, and then I'll get into the stuff we had for tonight, which is unintelligible. Lastly, Lewis well understood that the kind of thought that I've been sharing with you in the last 3 weeks, this is the 4th week, he believed most people either don't have the time to engage in this kind of thought, or they don't have the interest. What he never did, as best as I can find, never did. He never blamed or looked down on anyone who either couldn't or didn't engage in these kinds of topics. And that's why, in the end, he believed higher education is not for everybody. Contrary to what the American culture has told people now for decades, Lewis thought it's not for everybody. But we should never look down on anybody if they're not part of it. He was an anti-elitist in that sense. Okay, Lewis and Wielenberg on the desire for perfect happiness. You're not walking out on us, are you, Dwight? You had it. Okay, yeah. Truthfully, I won't look down on you. I don't blame you in the least. The lack of fulfillment. Now, here's the idea. The lack of fulfillment of a desire is the presence of absurdity or meaninglessness. So, the inability to fulfill the desire for perfect happiness, because it's our ultimate end now on this type of view, it's our purpose of life, the inability to fulfill it means that life is ultimately absurd. Life ultimately doesn't make sense. Why? Because if you have a desire and you can't fulfill it, things don't fit together. They don't mesh. And that is the fundamental notion of absurdity, meaninglessness that's in play. Wielenberg, now, is somebody who's a naturalist. Wielenberg is alive today. I told you, like, yeah, DePaul University, out in the great state of Indiana. He agrees we all have the desire for perfect happiness, or we'll call it bliss, ultimate felicity. We all have it. But remember now, he's a naturalist. What does that mean? Typically, it means the following. There is no soul. There's no afterlife. There's no God. And material events cannot be explained in the kind of complete final story in terms of mental events. Again, a naturalist no soul, no afterlife, no God. And Lewis thought, most importantly and interestingly, it's the claim that you cannot explain physical events in terms of mental events. So you're a naturalist, like Wielenberg, and you do agree people desire to be perfectly happy. How do you explain the existence of that desire? Lewis's view is it's implanted by God. That's the explanation why we have it. Wielenberg doesn't believe in God. But he's trying to make sense out of things, okay? So he's looking for an explanation of our having this desire. He thinks the best explanation a naturalist can provide for our having this desire is an evolutionary explanation. We have this desire because it makes us better equipped, in a sense, to survive. It's adventitious for survival. Thus, he thinks, if, as a matter of fact, it happened, we come to have this desire, and it promotes survival and reproduction, it will, all other things being equal, be preserved. So the explanation for our having it is it's adventitious for survival and reproduction. And those of you who didn't have the privilege of reading this, or if you had the privilege of reading it and said, what in the bleep am I reading? I'll just read. Here is, I took it right out of that book when I wrote this book. Here's Wielenberg. The first important fact is that one of the main effects of this desire for perfect happiness is that it prevents a person from deriving lasting contentment from earthly things. This fact is important because deriving lasting contentment from earthly things can be quite disadvantageous, evolutionarily speaking. Dissatisfaction can benefit us in the long run. To see the evolutionary drawbacks of lasting contentment, consider a male human who's perfectly content as long as his basic needs, food, shelter, and sex, are satisfied. Once such needs are satisfied, he will have no motivation whatsoever to acquire additional wealth, power, status, or success. Indeed, he will have no motivation to do anything at all, other than perhaps ensure that his basic needs continue to be satisfied. Contrast this male with a second male who has the same basic drives, but who never achieves lasting contentment. Everything else being equal, the second male will likely do better than the first in the competition for limited resources. Evolutionarily speaking, a good strategy is never to be entirely satisfied with one's lot in life. Does a person like Wielenberg believe the purpose of our being dissatisfied is that it's adventitious for survival. Now think about this. Does Wielenberg, as a naturalist, believe the purpose of being dissatisfied is that it's adventitious for survival? No. No, it's interesting. Why is the answer no? Because on a naturalistic understanding of evolutionary developments, there are no purposes. There are no purposes. It is not, according to Wielenberg now, it is not our purpose to survive. Because there are no purposes on the naturalist understanding of evolutionary development. Wielenberg believes changes occur for no purpose whatsoever. And this is just standard. I'm just giving you standard naturalistic thought about evolution. Changes occur. Some of those changes are adaptive in nature. Other ones are not adaptive in nature. Those which are adaptive are just sorted out for no purpose. They remain because they happen to prove adventitious for survival. But there are no purposes. Survival is not a purpose. Disadvantages are not a purpose. They're just the results of random changes. Because there are no purposes. And you might be sitting there, because we're in a church tonight, you might be sitting there, this is crazy. There are no purposes. Yeah, that's right. That is what they think. So now, what would Lewis say in response to somebody like Wielenberg? He couldn't respond directly to Wielenberg because Lewis is dead. Wielenberg is still alive. First thing is, you might think, well, Lewis would just deny that there is any evolution. No, Lewis did not deny that evolution has occurred. There are interesting exchanges. People wrote to Lewis. You can go. I hear they're expensive now to get these volumes of letters. I love to read letters. My wonderful wife back here, when these letters were being published, originally, the Lewis letters, they were in these volumes that are like this thick. And we would, whenever we go into a good bookstore, we were looking for the next volume of these letters. And I had somebody tell me here not too long ago that those letters now are out of print, and it costs you a fortune to get a hold of one of these volumes. And I'm so thankful I bought these letters. But Lewis would get letters ad nauseum about everything under the sun. And believe it or not, he thought it was incumbent upon him to respond to everybody that wrote to him. And he engaged his brother to help out trying to respond to these letter writers. But he would get, there were interspersed in all these letters, there were people, one person in particular wanted him to publicly deny that evolution had ever occurred. And Lewis wrote back and said, I will not do any such thing. He says, I see no need for it. And as a matter of fact, he said he actually believed in it. Now, I just want to tease this out slightly. He would have clarified, I think, 3 senses of evolution. And he would want, first of all, to make clear that the idea behind Darwinian thought is descent from an original common ancestor. So you've got, up here at the top, you've got some organism, and everything kind of trees out from this. And you get descent coming down out of this organism. And he believed in that. No, rightly or wrongly, he believed in it. He says in the preface to The Great Divorce, I had you read a chapter out of The Great Divorce. It was chapter 8, I think. He wrote this: on the biological level, life is not like a river, but like a tree. It does not move towards unity, but away from it. And the creatures move further apart. So he's telling you right there, he accepts a kind of Darwinian picture of a common ancestor in this tree effect coming out from the common ancestor. Secondly, and this he rejects, okay? Descent from a common ancestor that is explicable only in terms of non-mental causes. This is Wielenberg's view. Wielenberg believes, like Lewis, there's descent from a common ancestor, but only non-mental causes can enter to explain that descent. You cannot have any kind of mental explanation of the descent. Thirdly, descent from a common ancestor that includes both mental and non-mental causes. That's the view that Lewis accepted. So Lewis believed there has been descent from a common ancestor, but unlike naturalists, Lewis believed God could have entered the picture to tinker with the descent from a common ancestor. Thus he maintained, I'll just give you another quote, with Darwinianism, that's descent from a common ancestor, as a theorem in biology, I do not think a Christian need have any quarrel. What does a Christian quarrel with? Lewis, the Christian quarrels with naturalism, not Darwinism as descent from a common ancestor. And now we think back, how would Lewis argue against naturalism? He thinks it all starts with our own thought. As thinking beings, we have mental explanations of our own reasoning. And because our own reasoning involves mental explanations, and this reasoning produces results in the physical world, there's no philosophical reason to reject the idea that God, being another mental agent, could enter into the explanation of the descent from a common ancestor. So that's the first point. He would not reject evolution. He clearly affirms it. What he thinks is important is what can enter the explanatory story to account for it. Unlike the naturalist, he says we're not restricted to non-mental explanations. Next point. Perfect happiness is not, as Wielenberg claims, disadvantageous. Indeed, were you to be perfectly happy, you would not care at all that you no longer had to engage in a battle to survive and reproduce. You wouldn't care at all. Lewis believed we're only interested in survival so long as we believe that we might be happy if we survive. If we come to believe that there's no prospect for happiness for ourselves now, we would have no interest whatsoever in surviving. It's the belief in the possibility of happiness that explains our interest in survival. Wielenberg flips it. He turns it on its head. Wielenberg says survival is the ultimate end, and we're only interested in happiness because it promotes survival. Lewis says, no, it's got completely, as he said last week in the letter to Malcolm, it's got it totally upside down. We only are interested in survival so long as we believe it's possible to experience happiness. He was a big fan of Dante's Purgatory, the Inferno. What's written above the entrance to hell in Dante? Abandon all hope, ye who enter in. If you have no hope for things getting better, being happy, you will not be interested in survival. Lewis took this very seriously. He thought the best depiction of hell was not fire, brimstone, all this kind of pictorial stuff. Lewis thought this is hell. It's a mental state in which you believe you're going to survive, but you have no hope of things ever getting better. So in The Great Divorce now, he has a character that's interested in personal survival. Wielenberg's talking about the survival of the species. Lewis says, well, the species would be made up of individuals, and he was more concerned about the individual. In his essay, The Weight of Glory, Lewis says everybody gets so, basically this is paraphrasing, everybody gets so concerned about the survival of the species, the planet, whatever. Lewis's view is these things are all transitory. None of them are going to last permanently. There's only one thing that's going to last permanently, and that's you. And he believed, once again, we live in a culture that turns everything upside down. And so he puts in The Great Divorce a character named Sir Archibald. And it's interesting what he says about Sir Archibald in terms of survival. So I'll just read this to you. Sir Archibald, who was in this life, quote, interested in nothing but survival. Well, in good time, the poor creature died and came here. So he's now on the outskirts of heaven, okay? He came here, and there was no power in the universe that would have prevented him from staying and going on to the mountains, going into deep heaven. But do you think that did him any good? The country was no use to him at all. Everyone here had survived already. Nobody took the least interest in the question. If he would have admitted that he'd been mistaken, he'd been mistaking the means for the end, and had a good laugh at himself, he could have begun all over again. So Lewis, survival and happiness. Sir Archibald was making survival the end, and happiness the means to the end. Lewis says this has just got it all upside down. The end is happiness. Survival is, in some sense, our means too. We have to survive in order to be happy. And in the end, Sir Archibald went back to hell. Lewis would have conceded, for the sake of argument. Now, when you get into argumentation, it's more than just trying to beat your opponent over the head. In argumentation, the best kind of argument is to concede as much as you can to your opponent in the argument, and then try and illustrate that given all that, your view is still problematic. So Lewis, just for the sake of argument, would have said the desire for perfect happiness, as Wielenberg believed, is selected for and preserved because it bestows evolutionary advantage. Given this concession, Lewis would have said, it follows, though, that the desire cannot be fulfilled. It would have resulted in absurdity in the universe. And Wielenberg agrees. If you did have a chance to read it, Wielenberg actually says, on his view of how this works, none of us will ever satisfy our desire for perfect happiness, and thereby there is absurdity in the universe. But, Wielenberg says, it makes sense that there is absurdity in the universe. Because after all, we're naturalists. And on the naturalist view of things, what we're out to do basically is make sense out of why there is absurdity in the universe. Now, what would Lewis have said at this point? Well, it's pretty clear what he would do. He would go back to Wielenberg and he would say, but what reason do we have to believe in naturalism? And we know, first week, Lewis argued against naturalism on this basis of the fact that we reason. And hence, if Wielenberg, as he clearly has, he has reasoned himself into believing naturalism, Lewis would have said, you're already not a naturalist, because you've reasoned yourself into naturalism. And thereby, Lewis would say, what we want to see from you, Eric, well, they'd be friendly chaps, Eric, we'd like to see your arguments for why you think there is no soul. We would like to see your account of reasoning. How does this work? And so Lewis would thereby engage him at that point. I talked with somebody, this person is not here tonight, very recently, about why Lewis is so popular amongst a certain kind of crowd, okay? And this person said to me, I think the answer is, I'm going to keep the type of crowd out of this. He says it's because Lewis took very seriously the nature of human beings. And he thought your view of a human being, of yourself, was so critical to your understanding of the universe at large, life at large. So many people that are interested today in Christian apologetics, these are people who try and give a defense of the faith. We've lived in a time period here for the last 50, 60, 70 years at least, when I used to read this stuff as a young man. The people I would read, nobody ever discussed the nature of a human being. What is a human being? Lewis thought this was absolutely critical for your own understanding of your view of things and basically explaining to other people why you hold views about other things in terms of yourself, what you think about yourself. And so when he's going to attack naturalism, he's always going to come back to the first person experience. Last point, and then I will see if you have any comments on this. In my book, we decided to, my co-author and I decided to end our discussion of the Wielenberg-Lewis exchange, with a philosopher who's writing these days on the meaning of life. His name is Metz, M-E-T-Z. Metz, I believe, is in South Africa now. He holds a position in South Africa. I think he did his PhD at Cornell. Metz, in one of his very recent books, says Hinduism and Buddhism show that not all human beings desire perfect happiness. Now, what makes Metz interesting is, unlike Wielenberg concedes everybody is interested in being perfectly happy. Metz says, no, we can't concede that. I think this is Metz's thinking. No, we can't. Metz is a naturalist also. We better not concede that, because if we concede that, we're going to be digging a hole for ourselves argumentatively. So Metz says, not everybody desires perfect happiness. Just take a look at Hinduism and Buddhism. Now, I have taken a serious look at Hinduism. At Ursinus, every year, for a long time, we would have the students read the Bhagavad Gita. And if you ever want to border on being in hell, try teaching a bunch of first-year college students, have them read the Bhagavad Gita. And they just look at you like, Prof, why are we reading this? And I would always say, I didn't choose it. This was a course taught college-wide. I didn't choose it. But then I would always add, I actually think it's the most fascinating read of the entire semester. And I'll be honest, we would read selections out of Exodus, Genesis. We'd sometimes assign the book of Job. I thought the Bhagavad Gita was the most interesting thing we would read in the semester. Now, why is that? Well, when you read this book, it's Hinduism. It's about a guy who's basically, he's going to have to fight in a battle against his brothers, his brethren, his relatives. And he's torn by this. And in the story is about, well, how to reconcile yourself to this position, to having to fight. And the fundamental thesis is, you are too attached to your desires. You're too attached to your desires, because desire aims at, the word that's constantly in the translation anyway, the word that's constantly used is fruits. Desire aims at the fruits of action. Desire aims at the pleasures that we get from our actions. The Gita, the whole premise is, that's our problem. We desire the fruits of our actions. We desire happiness. And what we have to do is we have to become convinced. We have to basically convince ourselves, we have to understand that we don't perform actions to get the fruits from the actions. We rather perform actions strictly because it is our duty to do the action, regardless of the fruits. So contrary to what Metz is suggesting, the Gita, the whole underlying premise of it is, we do desire to maximize our happiness. The problem is, we've got to disassociate ourselves from that whole idea. Buddhism is very similar. One little story here. Not only did I have a student very early on my first year that turned in a plagiarized paper, I had another student. I still remember his name. I'll give you his Christian name. His first name was David. And David started out the semester. He was a good student. Slowly but surely, his interest evaporated, the quality of his work deteriorated, and again, I was so naive as a first, second year prof, I decided I would ask David to come into my office because I was interested in saving the world. So I had David come into my office. I wanted to know, David, what is wrong? What's going on with you? I said, you're clearly capable. He looked at me and he said, I'm leaving Ursinus College. I said, oh, okay. Where are you transferring? I'm not transferring anywhere. Oh. Well, why not? He looked at me, dead serious, and he said, I have become a Buddhist. Now, Gardner, I did not laugh at him like that. I thought, you've become a Buddhist. And I right there and then, I knew I had to read seriously about Buddhism. I want to know what was going on. Well, it turned out, the more I delved into it, the fundamental problem, according to Buddhism, is we suffer. And we suffer because we desire. And when we can't satisfy our desires, it just causes more suffering. And so, when I'm reading Metz here, I'm going, no. His name is Thaddeus. No, Thaddeus, the Buddhist fully understands suffering's bad. We get into it because we're desiring pleasure, and we can't satisfy all of our desires for pleasure. Thereby, we cause more suffering. And the Buddhist ends up saying, now this is real hardcore Buddhism, you don't exist as a persisting entity. Now, you came here the first week, and it's amazing, you're back here for the fourth week. But you thought of yourself now as a thing that was capable of persisting through time, and you're sitting here tonight thinking, I was here 4 weeks ago. I was here 4 weeks ago. And boy, I wish I never would have continued to come to this thing. But you were here 4 weeks ago. The Buddhist, no. You weren't here 4 weeks ago. If you were here literally 4 weeks ago, that presupposes you're this thing that can endure through time. And you think, well, I'll exist, say this coming Sunday, to go to church on Sunday. Buddhist, no. The fundamental problem for Buddhism is you have to get yourself to realize that you are not a thing that can persist through time. And so this student was telling me, David, he was getting out of college, not just Ursinus, he was getting out, period, because there was no point in him going through college thinking about a job down the line because he wouldn't exist to get the job down the line. So even Buddhism, like Hinduism, doesn't deny that we desire perfect happiness. Indeed, those views maintain it's our desire for perfect happiness that creates hell. That is what leads to all the problems in life. I will end it there. Any thoughts? Dwight, you came back. You never went on, you never left anyway. Yeah.
I need your help to some other people here to benefit others. Lewis, desire, which is termed joy.
Okay, great.
Hillenberg, joy, the desire for perfect happiness. The dictionary. Exalted happiness or an instance of such feeling or expression of such feeling. Jesus facing his tortured death, according to John.
Yeah. Okay. When I first read Lewis, I saw joy, the word joy, and I'm thinking he's talking about an experience, okay, of happiness, something like that. When Lewis used the word joy, it actually referred to the desire for the happiness. So you had to reprogram all this. You know, when people write, and when he became well known, Dwight, he basically dropped all talk of this joy. The first book, I'm reading it right now, rereading it. You want to pick up something, Joanne. This is related to your question. It's called The Pilgrim's Regress by Lewis. It is pretty much the first book-length thing he ever wrote. And he wrote it in about 2 weeks, if I recall correctly. He had become a Christian. And he went up to visit his friend, Arthur, up in Belfast, and he wrote this thing, and it was a complete allegorical treatment of his own conversion. And you read it, and you're going, you come away going, man, what in the world am I reading when I'm reading this thing? He says there's an afterword in here, and he realizes, and he's later in life, on reading this book, this is what he's writing, 10 years after I wrote it, I find its chief faults to be those two which I myself least easily forgive in the books of other men: needless obscurity and uncharitable temper. He wrote about joy. It's in here, okay? And he had this very special kind of term of art, joy, not to refer to what desire is aimed at, but rather to the desire itself. And as he goes on, I think he realizes if he's going to connect with readership, he's got to disambiguate all this stuff. He's got to write as a normal human being. He then goes on in 1936 to write, and this is what put him on the scholarly map, The Allegory of Love. It was 1936. It put him on the scholarly map for the medieval concept of love. The next thing he writes is the problem of pain. It's a totally different kind of writing, what he's doing. He's writing to normal human beings. He's not going with this kind of term joy anymore, Dwight, because it gets confusing. And the problem of pain. I'd be curious. You can go by the problem of pain. He wrote this for largely an educated audience. And it put him on the map as a public intellectual. The BBC reads this thing. They want him to do radio broadcasts. And Lewis's name becomes a public name, and he just becomes world famous. So joy, we just need to translate that, Dwight, over into now the happiness. We think of joy as happiness. In early Lewis, joy, because he mentions this early on, joy actually referred to the desire for the perfect happiness, and it was very confusing. Secondly, I don't know if it's directly related or it helps. Christians seemingly like to distinguish between joy and happiness, as if joy is something else, separate from happiness. Lewis thought, now we moved over to joy being the object of the desire, not the desire. Lewis thought, no, joy is just happiness. Lewis read Thomas Aquinas, and when you read Aquinas, joy is the happiness, basically, that comes from intellectual activity, okay? So now, people who think about these topics, there are a few of us strange creatures that walk the earth that do think about these topics. People who have thought about it largely think there are two kinds of happiness or pleasure. Two kinds, broadly speaking now. One, bodily pleasure or happiness, where what we mean by that is the source of the pleasure, the happiness, is the body. The other kind of happiness is derived from the intellect, from mental activity. Aquinas thought of the mental source, the pleasure, that happiness that came from the mental source. He tended to think of that as joy. In our day and age, you mention pleasure, and I think, not unlike past generations going way back, the first thing that comes to mind perhaps is bodily pleasures. And hence, pleasure, Lewis knew full well, can get a very bad name, particularly amongst Christians. But he thought, no, it isn't the sweetness of the apple that's bad, it's the stealing of the apple. And the pleasure that comes from eating the apple is good. It's just that it was unjust for you to take the apple in the way that you did. So Dwight, you're right on target. Did I do any kind of justice to your question?
Yeah, because Paul Ellery in various studies never mentioned shalom or peace, wholeness, and that would make more sense in a mental joy. And then that kind of bridges Aristotle, which you would probably be able to
I missed the very last few words.
Oh, that Lewis would vehemently deny
Yeah, Lewis, Aristotle, he liked Aristotle in certain parts. When I kind of paint these broad strokes, I mean, certain things Aristotle said, Lewis thought Aristotle was absolutely right. Same thing with Aquinas. It was just on certain things, he said, no, no, no. But both Aristotle and Aquinas had a different conception of happiness, and that's what bothered Lewis. It was not the ordinary person's conception of happiness. It was a very philosophical, highfalutin view of happiness. And Lewis, because he was very commonsensical, Dwight, he believed, this is why he would never ridicule or look down on people who either didn't share his interest in this stuff or just didn't have the time for it. He thought the Aristotelian Thomistic view of happiness, Thomas basically took up this kind of Aristotelian view. It was a view of the philosophers. And the philosophers, I read that quote last week, he thinks the philosophers go off the path on this issue. On other issues, he was fully in accord with Aristotle and Aquinas. You know, in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, happiness is very much this idea, it's the contemplation of God. Now you have to think about it. It's the contemplation of God. It's not the pleasure you get from contemplating God. The happiness is the contemplation itself, where they take contemplation to be this mental act. And Lewis thought, no, it's not the act itself, but rather the fruit of the action. And he was in no way opposed to contemplating the divine to the extent that we can. And he said, absolutely. What we do is we fall down and worship. And Lewis is, passages where he says, you know, in some sense, I'm paraphrasing, you know you've arrived when you get delight, pleasure from worshiping. To the extent that it's a duty, something like that, you haven't arrived. Somebody else. Zach.
Has Albert put out anything in regards to like higher rates of like mental health deterioration out of affluent societies?
Has who put out? Oh yeah, Veal, yeah, okay.
He's still alive. I'm wondering what his thoughts would be. It just seems to the point that most affluent societies right now are suffering from the highest degree of mental illness and like loss of purpose and suicide.
Yeah. I'm going to guess here. No is the answer to your question. He's a philosopher, so he's not a sociologist, psychologist, anything like that. It would tend to be more empirical in nature. I would think not, but I don't know. Yeah, I've often wondered about that. We live, from what I can gather, and I'm not an historian, but we live in an incredibly affluent culture compared to generations of human beings going way back. I mean, we have just unbelievable things at our fingertips, literally. Lewis thought one of the greatest inventions of mankind was anesthetizing, the ability to anesthetize, just pulling teeth, doing things like that. And it seems to me, as somebody who taught for 35 years, I noticed a precipitous increase now, is that right? Precipitous increase in psychological problems for students. I mean, we wonder about the cost of higher ed. I can tell I haven't been on the inside. One of the explanations for the higher cost of higher ed is the government now mandates that you have on-site mental health experts. You got to pay these people. When I was in college, you would just go off campus for stuff like that. No longer. The university, the college has to provide these services. And we have to be careful here. We live in an age when people are incredibly mentally fragile. Incredibly mentally fragile. I'm getting the timeout signal. Yes. No, not timeout quite yet. Right. Yeah, Lewis is an academic. He's not just a philosopher, just academics in general. When you're on the inside, you quickly learn what the most important issue academicians are concerned about. They're interested in explanations of things, okay? They're not interested in just memorizing a bunch of data or whatever, facts, or I use the word data, yeah. Higher ed is really fundamentally about questions and the explanations that provide the answers to these questions. And this is where Lewis would have told this person, you kindly, I think, but sometimes he could be a mean SOB. You are off on the wrong track. What we're interested in, it's really irrelevant to our Christian faith whether we descended from a common ancestor or not. What we want to know are the explanations for these things, and not just the fact of a descent from a common ancestor. The only way, and I'm not taking a position on this, I'm going to tell you this right now, but you know, in our day and age, one of these huge issues is global warming or climate change, things like this. The academic isn't so much interested in, is there climate change? I mean, I used to go out and ice skate half the winter because it was so frickin' cold back in the 1950s or whatever. Lewis, why would anybody deny that? What we're interested in is what explains. And I think Lewis would be somebody who would say, I think he would say, I think the verdict's still out on that. Just knowing the mind of Lewis, I think he would say, we probably really don't know what explains all this. Are we going to deny that it's warmer now than it was back in the 1950s? Heck no. What we weren't interested in are the explanations of these things. They want to ask questions, so we're going to... Yeah. My dear wife. Yeah.
You were talking about evolution before. I took it that evolution was body.
It is.
Mentally, we were...
Great point. Yeah. Evolution is concerned with bodily events, bodily change, okay? So it's what the naturalist does is bodies are all that we are. So it's strictly concerned with descent from a common ancestor in terms of bodily development. Lewis thought God created souls and, loosely speaking now, infused them into bodies. Lewis thought, well, you give an account of the human body, you haven't given an account of me. what I am. So he had this, they're two different things. So you make a great point. But Wielenberg thinks that's all that we are. So once you've given an account of us in terms of bodily development, there's nothing left to be accounted for. That's why Lewis would interact with them, and he'd say, we need to understand where he's coming from on this. He's denying any type of self that's separate from the physical body. And we want to know, well, why does he think there is no self that's separate from its physical body? Great point. You're not going to embarrass me, are you? No, thank you. Yeah.
If you could have a heated argument with a naturalist to try him to see Lewisian side, from your own words, what would you say?
With a naturalist?
What you would say to the naturalist to help him see the other side? Not what Lewisian would say, but you yourself.
Yeah, I'm trying. That's good. Last week I was asked a question, what did I think? And I said, well, it's irrelevant what I think. I'm not here to tell you what I think. I'm here trying to tell you what Lewis thinks. This question is, what would I say to a naturalist? Because most of the people I work with for all these years are naturalists. And I would just state my own view of things. I'm not out to prove to anyone else where they've gone wrong. The hardest thing, at least, is understanding my own view of things. We live in a culture, everybody's running around telling everybody else. And most of these people have no idea of what they themselves think and how they would explain it and justify it. Yeah, so that all the years I taught, most of the material I assigned in my courses was material I disagreed with. And is it okay if I talk just a couple more minutes here? Is that all right, or everybody want to go? I'll never forget these incidents. I taught the philosophy of mind, which is a course about what is the self. The entire course was basically comprised of naturalist material. Get to the end of the course, student, he was bright. He went to Penn after he left Ursinus. He raised his hand, he said, well, Prof, what do you think? And I said, you really want to know? And he says, yeah, I do. I would like to know. I said, okay. And I told him what I thought. It was antithetical. It blew his mind. Absolutely blew his mind. He just couldn't believe it. I can still see him sitting there. You're not serious. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, everything we read in this class. I said, yeah, I know. He said, well, why? And I said, because I understand so much better what I think by reading and thinking about things I disagree with. And I think all of us could benefit from a healthy dose. We have this expression today, what, we're in the silos or something like that. We could all use a healthy dose of reading things we disagree with.
So if you take the opposite side of that coin, and naturalists are trying to explain their position or maybe justify their position, isn't the very nature of that contradictory to naturalism?
Yeah, that was Lewis's point.
Well, wait a minute, your reasoning was, why don't you, why wouldn't they just
Yeah.
go, I couldn't care less what you think, naturalism is the fact, and if you believe it or not believe it, that's just because you haven't naturally evolved or naturally adapted the way you
Yeah,
need to.
that was Lewis's view. People who are naturalists, they reason about their own view, and that was Lewis's critique in Miracles. He thought that was the problem with the view. You couldn't reason yourself to the view because the view excluded reasoning, and he just didn't understand it. Yeah, it's interesting. Education, teaching, because I could go on with stories, but I won't. Anybody else? Okay. Garden? That's it. We're out. And by the way, I always tell my classes, I get the last word. Thank you for sticking it out.